Alright, it's Coach Nefarious, or Assistant Coach Nefarious, and I'll be analyzing these two games. My VSP Academy team against a team that I currently do not know. I'll just assess that gameplay and look up the name afterwards, just to connect the dots there. Alright, so let's have a look. We got an interesting situation going on here, where we went for an early invade but didn't stick around to that side, which is extremely dangerous, as seems to be painfully imminent at this point. Now, if you think about it, there's two aspects to it, right? There's the team play aspect and the micro aspect. I think I'll just stick with the team play aspect for now, which is simply that if you invade a side, usually if you look at pro play, it would be very, very exceptional to find a reason to then transition back to the diagonally opposite side of the map, where you have essentially no control at all, right? So obviously, if you just went straight back to your blue buff, the chance that they somehow slip by are rather slim, especially if you have the pixel brush ward. So that would be extremely exceptional, but diagonally it is a different story, right? So that to me just seems like something that's just off the table. Alright, so you got Orianna versus Veigar in the mid lane. Orianna abusing the Veigar a little bit. It's just all micro. I won't focus too much on micro unless I see very specific, interesting patterns. Now, here we see the Kled engage. Nothing too particular there. In this kind of match, let's just analyze what should be happening here. You'd think that Ezreal Yuumi would have a little bit more presence in this lane, trying to. Essentially, I don't think they should have priority, right? I haven't watched a pro play match of Ezreal Yuumi versus Sivir plus some random support, but I do think that they shouldn't be getting pushed in this quickly. They should be able to counter the shove a little bit. Anyway, so if you look at the top lane, you got Kled versus Vladimir. That sounds like it's, you know, it's a hard time for Kled, because it's very hard to abuse the Vladimir. I think his biggest opportunities in general should be coming from the roams towards mid or bot lane. Especially since it's a Veigar cage. Well, try Veigar caging Kled who's ulting on you. That's going to be quite hard. So I think that's going to be quite a dangerous setup, especially with the Olaf coming in there through the movement speed that Kled grants his teammates. Alright, so in the meanwhile, we have this crazy setup over here. Looking at Sejuani, this was a very important moment, right? If you think about the setup in Lane Brush here, you gotta realize that Ezreal Yuumi is one of the most disengage heavy lanes in the game. So it's gonna be extremely hard to find a way of engaging, because even a Nautilus hook like this only works if your enemies miss micro, and after it lands, they can still E out. They still have flash, right? So they have TP. You see, like, they have sort of safety upon safety upon safety measures stacked on top of one another. If you think about the gank setups, if you were to focus Sejuani right now, so this is the setup that I meant, by the way. I think I called it out when it wasn't happening yet. I saw Sejuani rounding towards the bot side and then leaving before this. This is the second time that this happens. And again, I don't like it at all. Yeah, right, this is the second time that happens. So you should at least have a sweeper when you go for those tactics. What you can do is set up a ward into the pixel brush and then go for oracles. I think that's the most efficient tactic right now that's being used by some of the pro teams. Usually, whoever wards early on, there's not a lot of wards at level 1 used in pro play. Actually, it's used quite sparingly, but those who ward usually get the oracle's lens, just to abuse the shared cooldown timer, as well as actually get the oracles on the jungler, right? So that's just a little tactic to pick up on. And in the meanwhile, Sejuani goes back to Krugs, very sound. This is a moment. This is a very important moment already. It's like, at this moment, nobody knows where the Olaf is, right? And nobody tracked him. So, we kind of want to know where he's going next. This would have been a great time for someone who's pushing to try and look for a little cheeky ward. Like, for example, Vigar has ward, Vladimir has a ward. Vladimir has been pushing. That would be a good moment to walk up to river, use the plant, right, the scrying orb, or whatever it's called. You know, the scrying plant. That one. You know what I mean. And then take away the bomb plant from that lane, deny Olaf that easy opportunity to shoot into that lane. Because in that case, a shallow ward isn't going to be enough. So this Sejuani presence is giving Vladimir a false sense of security, right? And you can see here, Olaf just going ham on this guy, gets booped back. Kled misplaying that. Alright, anyway, so that one, for me, what stood out is that nobody made an effort to deep ward the jungle. That should be a staple tactic once those first clears are done, right? You kind of want to set up vision in rivers and whatever at the start. Once you start pushing up and you got these situations with the bomb plants, right? Where someone doesn't show on the ward until they're already in the rush. That's just a situation where you want to take over and say, we'll scout them out and get the plants. Should be a staple tactic. This should just be a staple tactic for the team. After every slow push, I try and establish this. Let's say I coach some silver teams, right? I've talked about that with Vikrov. And one of the things that I really try and establish in those kind of teams is do the things that are essentially simple to execute, but have a very big impact in terms of control over the early game. And then they'll miss micro in a billion different ways after you tell them to do that, and whether they do it or not. But at least they have a decent setup to start the game out with a slight lead over less prepared opponents. Especially as well, we should identify our sort of early, mid, and late game win conditions, and primarily not just split. I mean, that's a very generic comment, right? But what I mean with that is, for example, in this case, Sejuani. Yeah, Sejuani's really good at ganking, but she doesn't have very easy gank setups, right? Because Orianna was running Flash Cleanse and had both summoners up for most of the time. So unless Sejuani's more aimed at ganking early on, it means that she's playing for control instead. And that's what I mean with early game win conditions, right? Which lanes do you focus on and how, right? I would say that in this kind of setup, you have a kind of triple scaling team, which I don't think it's sound. I don't think it's theoretically sound to have a Vigar mid lane and a Vladimir top lane and a Sivir bot lane, right? Because if you don't draft Nautilus into an easily gankable enemy bot lane, then you don't have that easy of setup to gank any lane and win early on. And with that in mind, I think that if you look at the enemy team, they could have gone and sent Olaf top lane 100 billion times. Like, Olaf could be top lane, could be bolting top lane right now on this bounce here. I think it's bouncing. I think Kled shouldn't touch a wave and it's gonna bounce, right? It looks like Kled's trading on his own right. If that works, then they can set up a dive, right? They should just have absolute dominance in there. Now let me look at this one more time. So, look at this, right? Look at this. So Ezreal makes a crucial little error in positioning, right? He should always look at the support. Do I have this? Can I actually use this? Let me see that. Yeah, I can. So, let me get this. So Ezreal, if you think about it, if the support is over here, right? And the turret or point of safety, there's a threat over here. There's a point of safety over here, right? He wants to move away from the threat and towards his point of safety, which is most efficiently done if those are exactly in the same direction, right? So right now, if he moves over here, then he wants to move away from his threat over there, but also towards the point of safety over there, right? The bigger this difference in angle is, the worse off you are positionally speaking, right? You want to minimize this angle, which is done simply by going directly on top of the line between your point of safety and your threat, right? So you want to maintain the angle as much as you can. Obviously, there's also minions to worry about. That's where you can start varying from this little perfect, quote-unquote, perfect spot, right? But you don't want to purposefully just go all the way to the other side. Like, that's how you get pinched, right? Because Now you are kiting behind your minions, but you're gonna get pinched if someone ganks you, or if they now just... Oh shoot, I cut off. I don't know which aspect I mentioned last, but I'm just gonna summarize it by saying that we should stay on this line and avoid getting into a pinch somewhere if we keep looping around. Like, we can't complete the circle, so the further you go, the worse off you are at the end of that. This is obviously just talking about the enemy mistake, but this is relevant for us because this explains why the setup should not work. See that? Like that, and then he's like, oh, never mind. Right? And Vycroft does not take hostages. Let me say that. Look at this, right? Look at this. So, that's crazy, right? Walks all the way upwards. Why does Ezreal not walk back and up, right? Just mirror, essentially, you just mirror the move commands of the Nautilus, and that's how you stay on the perfect line with him, right? Because this is another situation where seemingly nobody has wards or something, on the blue side in this case. So, really, if you think about it, he shouldn't be standing in the range of Nautilus where he can just get ulted like this, right? It's a very, very good engage setup. If you think about it, this is a lot. I gotta admit that this is a lot harder to juke for the Ezreal. That Nautilus range is actually insane, which means that I understand that you can draft that way. That you can draft for a proactive engage setup in a bot lane this way with the Sejuani as follow up. So I do admit that I was apparently wrong on that in my analysis. Trial and error proved the analysis wrong, or at least that it's infinitely harder to actually dodge that setup. Like, it's a much better setup than I thought, even if it's not theoretically sound. Which, looking back on that right now, honestly, I do feel like it's impossible to dodge the Nautilus ult. So I was saying the analysis under the assumption that the Nautilus Q gets E'd, right? But he can initiate with ult, and that is undodgeable, and that lands the hook guaranteed. So that is what you just saw right there. So I stand corrected. Okay. Alright, so how does it change our game plan? It changes our game plan only very slightly. You still have double scaling and just a little bit of a more early game setup in the bot lane. If you think about it, then we can control the bot side and just try and essentially just deep ward, for example, to relieve pressure on the top lane, right? Just use vision control to let him stall it out. Complete a slow push when you can. Get pushed. Complete a slow push. He has wave clear to try and prevent dives, try and prevent heavy bounces, right? He can kind of manage the wave however he wants to, micro it out. Alright. This is a good example where I think that high economy is not as good as control. I think that Sejuani should have been in that bot side controlling the scuttle, controlling mid bot side. And if, let's say, if bot lane is doing fine on their own, then what? Then maybe even Vycroft can roam mid lane. But you see this situation, this is exactly what you want to prevent, right? You want to have your jungler here controlling the river. This is the only kind of situation this is exactly the type of situation you want to prevent. Now, obviously, you can talk about the micro decision making. You can talk about, you know, given that Sejuani is here, given that this person is here, where should you move and why, blah, 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 blah. In my opinion, that misses the underarching point of Sejuani controlling the right side in accordance with some sort of game plan. In this kind of situation, the tempo was just much higher than what would warrant Krug's Raptor clear. Right, if you just went and controlled that side first and then went Wolves, Raptors, Krugs, for example, right? You already controlled it, you put a deep ward in Olaf's jungle and then went through mid lane towards your Raptors, absolutely fine. In a lucky situation, you would even find some enemy camps up, right? But even if not, that's not a problem, right? You're Sejuani, you're not very high economy, you don't need that instant respawn. If you were a Kartus, that would be a different story. Even then, honestly, actually, even then, still in this kind of situation, is it worth potentially throwing away the lead you have in bot lane? In this case, it wasn't too bad. It was only the support dying, and Sivir could manage, but my point still stands. All right, so Kled is abusing that top lane pretty heavily. 7-0. That is quite impressive. I do feel like Vladimir top lane works well with a kite comp. And an example would be if you have Kindred in the jungle. Vladimir Kindred, yeah, that's an excellent kite comp. If you have, let's say, if you run a comp with maximum disengage and you have some sort of early game priority through like disengage / poke, like Sivir Karma or whatever it is, right? Those kind of setups. Then you can have some catch in there or some engage in there, some like disruption. You have different flavors of that comp, right? I just feel like if you're committing to more teamfight oriented comp, then maybe drafting the Vladimir isn't the brightest idea. Alright. All micro aside, it is a very hefty dive. All micro aside, I feel like the setup was there. The execution on the setup was not there. Haha. Rip Vikrov. Alright. So yeah, that was, I mean, honestly, the setup is there, right? Slow push some waves in. Dive on that big stack of minions. Set it up. Yep, that's all fine. Got the pink wards. Got the vision control. You guys really seem to prepare a setup. Like, you guys actually prepared, like, a pink ward setup everywhere and started, like... You guys really warded out and then went there and did your thing. Like, it does look coordinated. So even though it didn't work out, that's something you can just do this 3 more times and then perfect it, right? It's like, I feel like the idea itself was very sound. Alright, anyway. So you got, like, in this case, this is a good example of what I would call a low tempo situation. A lot of lanes are just returning to the lanes right now. Oh, whoa! So, with Kled and base, I would say this is a situation in which you have one wave to shove before Kled gets back on the map, before Orianna gets back on the map, and things might hit the fan. So this is after you cleared, for example, Raptors. And in this case... Clearing 2 camps like that, I think is very, very sound. So I think that's very sound routing by the Sejuani here. Like, in correspondence with this, with the amount of tempo of the game right here. Like, you know exactly when Olaf's coming back on the map and when you need to be there to control that bot side. You do need to know. Okay, in this case, Orianna cannot do this roam. That is impossible because she will get pinched really, really hard by the Veigar and the Sejuani. In this kind of case, you have a 4-man in that bot lane. You cannot set up a dive against a 4-man. That seems trivial to me. It might not seem trivial if you don't see where Olaf is, but you guys no longer have the deep vision to guarantee that, right? Which should, in and of itself, say enough. Alright, I'll see you guys in part 3. Alright, part 3 after a long, long pause during this game. I was like, I'll just wait it out. Well, let's not wait it out, because that is quite the issue there. I haven't been listening into the commentary, so I don't know what it is, but let's actually analyze the game again. So, what is going on here is a miss micro, but a good setup. Was a great setup, like was very sound. Yeah. Too bad for the Veigar player. Now let's look at our response, right? Let's look at what we do. When you notice here, like Kled first hesitates for a second and leaves, it's quite telegraphed what he's going to do and why, right? So Olaf is setting up in mid lane. That is very predictable, very sensible there, right? So we should be prepared for that. Now, Kled didn't initiate with his E in time, so that's quite bad. Because that means that the Orianna ball didn't connect. Should be eating through that. If he gets stunned, is not a problem. Alright, anyway, so V-Croft just hammering them down. And a little like Dawn making short work of that bot lane with the help of Nautilus. Alright. Let's think about what is going on here. Why is it going on? What's the setup? What's the game like? What can we do about it? You think about both teams, right? You see one team running Ezreal Yuumi bot lane. That immediately sets a precedent for the rest of the comp, right? Disengage poke, mid game comp, right? Orianna kind of shouts, you know, big fights through choke points, or even in open spaces for a little bit, but preferably in these little choke points where everybody's forced to be clumped up, right? And then you have Olaf, same thing, right? Runs people down, doesn't care as much about the chokes. And you got Kled. Again, you know, works well with... These three work well with one another. They kind of run you down and try and catch you through the chokes and whatnot. But if you think about it, the Ezreal Yuumi makes this composition very different. While on our team, we have that engage setup with Nautilus, but we kind of have a triple scaling comp setup. So if you think about it, I don't know in what order was being drafted, but you kind of would want, on the blue side, they would want to abuse the scaling comp heavier. And on the red side, it would be nice if you had a more stable setup, like just stable, early, mid, late, just balanced out. A balanced out comp would counter this kind of inconsistent, you know, Yuumi disengage, Orianna like AoE team fight, Olaf run you down extended team fighting, like it doesn't really line up that well. You got Olaf, Kindred, Karthus, which I think fit similar compositions in different situations. And then you got Ezreal Yuumi, which go well with that. But then Kled and Orianna don't really fit in with that picture. You would see, let's say, Karma Flex pick, or let's say you would see an Akali, or let's say in top lane you got the Vladimir, for example, right? Let's say you got Akali early game, right? Vladimir late game, and Ezreal mid game. That's like distributing the win conditions evenly. You got a lane with priority there, maybe even two. It kind of depends on the game state. Not too big a deal there. And you got a sort of consistent plan with your comp, right, that you can follow through on quite clearly. If we look at that on the enemy team, if we look at that on our side, right, once it becomes clear that we have a Vladimir, for example, it would make a lot of sense to run a Kindred, Karthus, Olaf with that. And then, let's say, in the mid lane, let's say we had Sejuani first, it would make a lot of sense to put a Rise, or even an Aatrox, or, what more is there? Nico, or if that's banned, which it usually is, you got... I mean, Rise, honestly, Rise and Nico is already 2 force bans, so, like, if you don't have that, like, obviously Sejuani can go with, any mid laner that has early game gank setups. That would be ideal. And this is kind of the meta where there's so many prolific disengage bot lanes that the engage setup becomes kind of hard to draft the composition around. So in the case of Ezreal Yuumi, I gotta say that Nautilus engage setup works a lot better than I thought. So if that's a counter pick, I would totally get that in terms of draft. And yeah, that makes this composition. Let's say the Nautilus was a response, and let's say the Sejuani was like a first pick or something, right? I can always actually look at the draft afterwards, but I like predicting it and talking about the different scenarios to gain an understanding in general. In that case, I would probably not draft 2 scaling mages in the other lanes. Let's say if you already have sort of an engage setup and they have like a follow-up engage with like scaling mage and mid lane, then you can put something more proactive on top lane. Let's say if you did want disengage, let's say if your top laner plays Fiora against Kled, then you have the counter pick there, right? Let's say you had to blind pick it. You know, there are some more defensive champions that you could drop for top lane. Right now, Renekton's being picked up in pro play, right? That's like, you know, you have some follow-up engage. Then you have, like, initial engage with Nautilus. Renekton comes in. Then Veigar comes popping out of the woodworks from the backline. Everyone got something to add to the compositional synergy that you already have, right? You can also draft two different groups. As I said, with Fiora counterpick, you just have a 4-1 comp instead of a 5-man. As you can see, both teams are struggling to follow up on these little micro engages, right? Both teams are struggling to really just burst through there, like, and commit. There's not like a very big wall of CC that you can just follow through on, and just like, you know, if you look at team fight tactics, you know that feeling you get when the entire enemy team gets CC'd and you just bust through that wall, and before the last CC ends, the next one comes in. That's not really the feeling that's created with what we got going on here. Alright. So, haha, Ripperino. Okay. So obviously there's a lot of individual stuff happening, of individual observations, individual microplay. Let's say observing the top lane. Oh, top lane's missing. What is their intention? They're gonna dive mid lane. Where's the Olaf? Probably also setting up there. Where's the support? He's actually in bot lane. And then how do you respond? Well, you just gotta probably just get away from the turret for 1 second, establish some control, and if you really feel like they aren't, like, if you know they aren't committing at to it at that point, you can just get back in there. But usually they want to make that play quickly, right? They're not going to have 4 people around mid lane and not do anything. So you can take your time finding control, stepping away from the turret. If you are almost sure that Kled is going to look for it, which you should be, right? You should be sure of it. Now Vikrov is headed to that bomb plant. He will get there in time. Hoo-hoo! Quite the play there. Quite the play. Now, Kled, not entirely synergetic. This is a good example, I feel, where you're really taking out all possible margins when you take out a defensive ward while behind, right? You guys are slowly being dominated, you're losing map control, but you're going to, in the face of potential long-range engages and rundowns, you're going to take out all possible margins and go for that pink ward. I don't think the principle behind that, I don't think, is sound. Even though in this case, the blue team engage wasn't clean, they popped the Kled ult, but either it wasn't communicated properly, they didn't follow up on it, or it was just one big mess. I don't know how you could potentially screw it up. I don't want to watch it 3 more times and come to a conclusion on that. Something has to have gone wrong. I know that. It's clear. It's obvious. Again, we don't really have that map control, especially since we already mentioned how blue team wants to fight. They do want to fight through the choke points, right? Line up those Ezreal ultimates, Orianna ultimates, even Kled ultimates. Even Kled, like, you can sort of juke around it when you're, for example, in open terrain. It is possible to kite around the Kled. It is possible. Not always, not easy, but you can. Alright, so, main conclusions here for the team is, or at least in my opinion, let's just write those down. So, I would say number 1 is commit to a composition. That's number 1 for me. Like, okay, so we got like disengage scaling, right? If you go by each lane, right? You got scaling, Let's divide it up in early, mid, or late game, right? Come on, yeah. We can do it. Okay, early, mid, late. And then you look at their team. Let's look at our team first. So you got Vladimir, pretty clear. Sejuani, it depends. In this kind of team, where she doesn't have the easiest setups, I'd say mid-game. Right? Mid-late. Like, she does get run down. She's not as strong as some of the other ones late game. It depends a little bit on the compositions. She can add a lot of compositional synergy that functions well in late game. So it's a little bit conditional. Then you got Vigar, obvious. Can spike in mid game if you have a lot of farm, if you play well. But it's about the on paper, right? If you're drafting, like what are you drafting for? You're not drafting Vigar for its early presence, even though it can create gank setups. It can actually do stuff early on. That's for any champion in the game. Same for Vladimir. And then you got Sivir, Nautilus. That's, you know, you could call that whatever you want. It has a little bit of compositional synergy with a rundown comp, which isn't really used on this team too much. And it has a little bit of more strength in late game than the Ezreal. That's not why you want to draft it in the first place, though. It might outscale the Ezreal. But that's usually it's a late game setup. It would be a late game setup, right? So you got top lane. If you look at this, right, this is a very, very late oriented comp. And if we look at the other team and compare it, you got Kled, which is like level 6 / after you get like 1 or 2 items. I'd say that's early mid game. It's earlier than the Sejuani. Kled isn't as overwhelming early as people think on those first few levels, especially. Olaf, definitely early mid. Let's say level 6 as well, so that's another one. Then you got the Orianna, which is also early mid game, right? Ezreal Yumi, early mid game. You see where I'm going with this. They got a very consistent composition in terms of the power spike timing, which I think in the current meta is not that great. Ideally, you'd want to have something in the early game, something mid, and something late, right? So this is I'd say this is like a 6 out of 10. This is like a 5 out of 10. You know, like you got a late game scaling win condition at least, but again, it's a lot harder to achieve than if you had something early game to focus on. And essentially, because Nautilus found those engage setups, because of the micro, you could say that this got shifted over. This really created an early game opportunity, right? But if that gets negated by our enemies through appropriate control with the Olaf, right? If Olaf could just focus on that bot side, he doesn't have to attend to his top side, then how is Sejuani going to get in there? Olaf counters Sejuani pretty heavily, which means that they get an extra sort of quote-unquote priority, and they can just negate this one little differentiation from late to early game setup, right? Alright, now let's take a look at the, what's it called, the compositional synergies, right? So, Sivir running down, right? Like kiting. Then you got Nautilus, which is like... Nautilus is a little bit different, right? It's like point and click collapse, is like hard engage, right? Then you got, let's say, Sejuani, which is hard engage, right? Then you got Vlad, which is like run down, right? Kite. And you got, wait, Vigar, yeah, at the top, which is like a little bit harder to define in my opinion, a little bit less obvious, but I'd say it's great at control, right? It's great. I would call this a control team. It's not really running someone down. It's a different way of kiting, right? So running someone down, essentially you can go in or out. Vigar is more like slowly go out, slowly kite. So it's like kite / control, whatever you want to call it. right? Okay, so if you look at that, they're kind of three different things, right? Essentially, what synergizes well with hard engage is follow-up engage, right? So let's say you got a Olaf to run people down with a hard engage. That's actually fine. So we have some good synergies here. This is not the worst composition, but it's going to be hard to drag it through the early game. Okay, so what would be a better comp? Let's say you got Vlad in top lane, and then you run, let's say, another one like Kindred, and you want something more early game oriented that grabs priority, like Akali or Orianna or whatever, like Nico, for example, right? So let's say you draft the Akali, and then you got to have a bot lane. Let's say you got Sivir, and you have some sort of like, maybe even Braum, because you do kind of lack a tank in this composition. Some Sivir Braum. So if you look at that, it's like you got early, mid, late. You got late game, you got mid game / late game, you got early game, you got mid game. You kind of got it distributed, which is what you want, right? Most of your stuff is mid game. You got to have some stuff in early game. And depending on what kind of team you are, you can orient your comp a little bit more towards the late game or towards the early game. Whatever, towards mid game. Whatever it is. Mid game is most standard, right? With a little bit late, a little bit early. That's default. Just like with compositions, default is hard engage, hard engage, hard engage, right? That's your default composition when you start a team and you draft for a newly formed team. That's the first thing you try out, right? Alright, so anyway, so if you look at the compositional synergies, you got, let's say, how many do you have? I mean, honestly, I'm not going to list them all, but this is like kite / run down, right? This is like kite / run down. This is like, not really run down, but more like battling in an extended period of time. So let's say extend fights, right? So it's not really controlling as in how you disrupt people with control, with the Vigor cage. It's more like controlling through DPS, right? So it's extending the fight, kiting around. Then you got Sivir, which is run down. And you got a little bit of control, right? Like, so you feel like, you see how it's like, you got 3 like this, and then you got 2 that are just a little bit more on the extending it and controlling side, right? These kind of synergize a little bit with one another, and that's it. You got like a consistent comp where you got 3 out of 5 doing roughly the same thing. If you want to go all out and say screw the tank, you're gonna go with like a Karma, then you'd have 4 out of 5. And let's say you got a rundown mid laner, what would that be? Let's say an Aatrox. That would be 5 out of 5 right there. That would be a fully committed comp. You can try and get the Aatrox to revive. This can help these champions to survive until they get their, for example, Vlad gets his heals and Aatrox gets his revive, right? So that's it. That would be, in my mind, a little bit more of a consistent composition. That's the first part of the summary. Alright, see you in the next one. Alright, so the second part of early game, the second part of the summary of this game is, so we talked about compositions, and now let's just look at win conditions and game plans, right? So let's say you got the lane focus, and that essentially gives you the where, right? You got the where, that's the lane focus. Then you got the when, which is the lane focus over early, mid, and late game, right? Early, mid, late game. Then you got the how, right? Which is like, do you want to proactively engage, which is just a normal type of gank setup, right? Do you want to teal or shadow a lane and counter gank? Or what you can do is, if you have a lot of priority, you can tower dive, right? You can turret dive. So that's a different type of setup that requires some control. Or you can invade, or you can take objectives, right? And they all sort of are just different ways of utilizing a certain type of setup that you have in the lane to abuse it and get resources. These are all ways of gathering resources on the side of the map, right? There's just different ways of doing so. You just go down the list. Okay, so let's say if you have priority, for example, then the gank setup might work if you can set up a freeze, right? So you just slow push, bounce it, and set up a freeze. That might be a setup for a gank. But then it would work best if you have some sort of engage setup there, right? If you don't have, let's say if you have a run down team, then you can sometimes do it just by running people down. But it depends on how many escapes the enemy has, the resources. This is where the game becomes as complex as it is, right? If you have a disengage setup, let's say you got Kindred plus Sivir Karma, the easier setup would be to just use the priority to just go out and invade. And first control the entire side of the map, get the objectives, and maybe set up a dive, right? That would be an easier setup, right? Counter ganking is always a difficult setup. It's most efficient when the shadowing of a lane can be done very closely to the lane, which is usually a mid lane, right? So this kind of synergizes with the mid lane with Raptor setup, right? When you're just on your Raptor, someone else is on their Raptors, and they come in like this, you come in like this, and you win the 2v2. Right, so that would be most common there. Now, if we look at the game plan here, you know that this is terrible because you can't really control it, you can't really gank it, you can't really do anything. You don't really have any clear setups in that lane. This one, Orianna has less escapes. Orianna, it's less of a stomp, right? It's a little bit more neutral. And it's a shorter lane. It's an easier gank setup. There's no escapes. It's short lane. You know, Sejuani can just barge in there and try and get the stun. You got double CC setup. So there's a lot of reasons why ganking would work potentially here. Let's say, so you want to have a sweeper. There's a lot of ways to make it happen, right? Trying to deny their vision control through setting up an early pink ward, setting up with a sweeper. Veigar wave management's going to play a role. The micro, right? Like trying to lure someone into the site where Sejuani is standing on. There's a lot of ways that you can implement these types of plans. That gets progressively more oriented towards the player and their particular tactics that they use to implement the game plans that the coaches hand to them, right? So anyway, so you got meanwhile you got in bot lane, you got what's it called? You got Ezreal Yuumi. And apparently that level 6 setup, this level 6 setup, I'm a big fan of that. So level 6, gank, hard engage, dive, whatever. It doesn't really matter where, it doesn't really matter when, you just get in there. This is a really, really good setup. Okay, so this kind of gives us a really nice little thing to prioritize after level 6 in most cases. Now think about what happens before level 6. So if you can't gank, right? Or if you can't, even more generally, if you have the initiative, right? And what do people do if you don't have the initiative, right? You're going to try and essentially manage your risk, right? That's something I mentioned earlier. You're going to try and counter the initiative. So you can potentially counter the initiative, or what you can try and do is just play for opposite sides, so avoid. Right, so this is matching and this is avoiding, right? Matching gives you more opportunities to express skill and take over the initiative. So counter is designed to take over the initiative. Avoid, essentially, let's say your gold curve looks something like this, right? At the start of the game. Now counter is designed to try and make it jump up like this and eventually take over, right? And you get this kind of gold chart. That's what you're trying to do when you do a counter plan. If you're using the avoidance tactic, right, then instead, instead, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to slow this down so much that eventually, you know, the gold curve just kind of diminishes and you just take over from that. you just outscale, right? You don't. This is something that works progressively worse the lower elo you go, because there's always going to be events that screw it up. If you don't have any initiative, it's just waiting for red team to get a lead and spike down just through individual micro misplays like this. Like, this is when you pick Gnar versus Aurelia or something, right? It's like, yeah, maybe Khan can do that, but a Master Tier top laner can't. A high Master Tiers in the old system couldn't do that. Tried it on my teams, did not work. 1-7, 1-6, 1-5 every single game. Just waiting to die, right? So anyway, you gotta go for these kind of tactics in this kind of scenario. And if you have priority in bot lane, so let's analyze the priorities, right? You got the map, you got 3 lanes. Cleta has definite priority. Orianna has definite priority, which you got the jungle counter matchup. And bot lane has some level of priority against him. This is the sign of a lost draft, right? You can't have triple scaling. This is questionable in conjunction with the fact that both of these are not really winning lanes, right? Something has gone wrong here. If you first pick the Sejuani, and let's say you pick the bot lane after that, then at some point you should have been able to counterpick something. You should have been able to counterpick the Kled or the... right, and just deal with this jungle matchup as having a strong synergy. So let's say if you get to pick Ryze Sejuani, and you don't have priority in mid lane, and you don't win the jungle matchup, you can consider banning Olaf. You can consider banning Kindred, right? You can consider focusing on this setup instead of, let's say, focusing on getting good bot lane matchups. Anyway, so what it means for your game plan is that here, you're gonna have to play around bot side. It's the only option, right? And since Olaf can get there as well, and they should win the 3-3s. At least you have some initiative with the bot lane to overtake that. So let's say you take Sejuani, and you just let her play around that bot side. Leave her Krugs and Raptors up, which means she's not farming as efficiently. But it would be nice if you got a ward on the Raptors and you time those Raptors. Let's say Olaf clears red Raptors, right? And that's at like 210, you know that's coming up at 440, right? So you know that if you get there at 430, that's a pretty safe timer to try and get there before Olaf does. Especially if you deep ward somewhere, right? If at some point you can get a ward down in that jungle, then you're gonna know those respawn times and you can try and get control over one part of the map for a little bit. So you gotta try and survive until level 6, right? Let's say if you're on the Raptor, let's say you have a Raptor ward and you couldn't manage to clear it because Olaf just gonna get there soon. You see him approaching on the ward, you leave before he gets there, right? What you can try and do is, let's say right now you're looking if there's an engage setup in bot lane, there is none, so you go to this. And right now is a moment where maybe you can teal that lane and set up a counter gank from the same side here, right? So all these little micro movements across the map are going to be very important in trying to maintain control over the early game here. Alright, well that's it for this one. That's my analysis of the first game. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.